I've also been trying to find out what the BBC is doing with podcasts, because Radio 4 has started to do podcasts, and I've looked at a couple of them, and I'm going to play a couple of extracts just as review and comment. We'll come on to borrowing content that turns up online during the Wild Show. I'm going to ask JD about this, because Access All Aerials have just done a 24-hour broadcast, and there's lots of stuff sort of prepared for that online in various places. And I didn't think we could nick it before their broadcast, but perhaps we can now. I don't know. JD will have an opinion on this, I would think. Anyway, my first thought about the Radio 4 podcast is that the content still seems to be what you might expect on Radio 4. So I'm not sure it's going to solve their problem of reaching a younger audience. I've got one example. The first one was just after the budget, and I think this is Evan Davies, who's the expert who appears in the centre of the podcast, and I think he's very reassuring in the sort of way that you might get an economics correspondent on the what is now called linear radio. I mean, this is linear radio. Phonic FM, by the way, 106.8 or www.phonic.fm. But this, I put the two clips on YouTube, and I think that's all right. I've only got about 4 minutes in all, I would think, at the moment. So you can find it as edit from podcast, Evan Davies on budget.
We screwed up the calculations, and tax revenue's coming in faster than we thought.
Evan Davies presents Newsnight and Dragon's Den. He's also one of the biggest economics experts in the building. And we asked him to come and explain some new figures. They're from the Office for Budget Responsibility. It's an independent expert body that works out how much money the country has. And these latest figures show the country does actually have more money than we thought.
10 to 15 billion pounds extra this year that we didn't think we'd have. The projection is that money will be, the revenues are going to be stronger every year for the next.
So it's not just one-off?
Not just a one-off.
Why? Because the economy is doing...
Yeah, so well, it just seems, it's quite hard to predict what the tax revenues are going to be. There does seem to be a little bit of extra growth in the economy, a little bit of extra inflation in the economy, which actually pushes up tax revenues. And that is going to mean, over the next few years, this is the crux of this, a lot of the government's difficult decisions over public spending will be made easier. At the moment, they're projecting a sort of continued squeeze on some departments, really mean squeeze on some departments. And they're projecting a little bit of extra money for the NHS. It would be really nice to give that extra money to the NHS and not have to squeeze all the other departments. 30 billion every year over the next few years would make all these decisions much easier. And then you genuinely could say austerity is at an end. We've already got 10 to 15 of that just from this miscalculation on the finances. And then there's one other place we can go for some extra money. The government's kind of projecting it to get borrowing down, to eradicate borrowing in the middle of the next decade. Well, we perhaps don't have to eradicate borrowing. We can allow ourselves a bit of borrowing. That would still be financially responsible.
So I thought that was quite reassuring about the end of austerity, or the balanced budget, or whatever, the responsibility of the budget. But it still got heavily criticised. The Daily Mail or the Mail on Sunday, number 10 Fury at most biased BBC bulletin in history, which was all about the effect on income distribution. But overall, I thought it was the same sort of reassurance that you might get in mainstream radio, and I don't know, or BBC radio, and I don't know whether that's going to appeal to a different sort of audience. While I find the next one, here's another track by the Rushes. This is called Every Other Night. and at least one of the rushes will be here about 10:30 or soon after today. I've got some new material coming out in December, I think. So here's another extract from a podcast. This is BBC Radio 4 doing one topic at a time per podcast, but it's similar to what you might get on the Today programme, I think. This is interesting. This is Amal Rajan talking about news. So it's sort of relating to social media and where perhaps some of the audience has for linear radio. That's FM as we know it. Anyway, I'll play the clip and talk about it afterwards.
Do mainstream media know how to report on populism?
I think it's incredibly important to intellectually engage with populism. But the difficulty comes when people say that by intellectually engaging with those people, you're giving them a platform and normalising fascism.
Well, I worry about this as a journalist. I worry about normalising offensive views. So if someone is clearly racist, homophobic, sexist, we're supposed to be impartial. But what are you then doing? Are you giving a platform to those people as well?
I think the only thing you can do is in each and every case say, what is the story here? What is the actual story here? And how do we tell it in the straightest way, which informs our readers and so our audience and explains the world to them? And sometimes that will mean that people see things on TV that they don't like. And sometimes people that they don't like will be given a degree of airtime that is uncomfortable.
Twitter, getting rid of the like button, a good idea? That's what everyone's been talking about in the last sort of day or two. I say anyone who cares.
Anyone who cares about Twitter. I think there's a few things. One is I have been extraordinarily struck by the incivility, by the just sheer rudeness that I see on Twitter. And I've tried very hard. I try very, very hard to follow a range of people, across the political spectrum. I think there's a couple of big dangers. One is that journalists, many journalists, particularly I guess journalists at the start of their careers now, spend so much time on Twitter that they think it's the real world. And I think that's a real, genuine, practical danger. I think it really does fundamentally warp what they think people care about, what's going on. That's one thing that's a problem. The second thing is, and all the time that you're on Twitter, and I've tried to massively control my social media consumption, so I'm out there talking to people, getting real stories about the real world. But all the time you're on Twitter, you're not out there necessarily doing real journalism, though obviously Twitter has its uses.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm not even a journalist. I'm a blogger, and I do a lot on Twitter, and I read a lot of tweets, and yes, it can just while away the day. But I find it quite interesting, and also at the moment, Aaron Banks was on the Mars show last week, and Twitter was not just the people I would say. I do try and follow some other people who don't necessarily agree with my starting viewpoint, but I think there's quite a lot of concern about that choice, because it wasn't just an interview; it was a platform. There was quite a lot of negative comments made about The Guardian and FT as sources, which there were different views about that on Twitter, but the BBC, I think, is tending to be fairly supportive of a conservative or pro-Brexit point of view in a certain sort of way. There's probably other people who take a different point of view on it. But I do notice that the story that there was an inquiry into Aaron Banks that was blocked by Theresa May when Home Secretary, that has appeared in the Daily Mail. To be fair to the Daily Mail, they probably did restart this. I think it was mentioned at a Labour Party conference, but didn't get much impact on media at that time. But the Daily Mail definitely did a better job getting attention for it, and it's also been in the Guardian and the Observer and places like that. But I just noticed that the BBC. Well, getting back to this is sort of relevant, because if these podcasts, this is my sort of conclusion about it at the moment. The podcasts are a format, but the content might have some influence as well. sort of depends what the content's going to be, and different people notice different things and have different points of view. But I do notice that this story is not turned up on the BBC yet, and I will play from Channel. Hang on a minute. From Channel 4, an interview with Ben Bradshaw. I think it's reasonable to play this because he is a local MP, and it sort of fits in with. Just the sort of another bit of background to this. The storyteller is still in France because he thinks of himself as European, and he's hoping, I think, to be able to spend more time in France rather than somewhere that is cut off from Europe. I think that's what is going through his head. You can probably find him through Twitter or through Facebook mostly. Anyway, this is from Channel 4 News, who also have an interesting interview with Aaron Banks just walking along in the street, where sort of different to the sort of access the BBC can get. Anyway, this is Ben Bradshaw, and you'll find this on the Channel 4 News website.
Well, the government usually doesn't comment on intelligence matters, but it simply won't wash for the government to hide behind that excuse on this issue. This isn't a traditional intelligence matter. This is a crime to subvert, or an alleged crime to subvert our democracy. So I'm afraid I will continue to ask the Prime Minister, as I expect will a fair number of parliamentarians in the days ahead, as to whether she did or did not block an investigation into Aaron Banks more than 2 years ago. Because if she did, that is incredibly serious, because I have been asking questions about this now for more than 2 years in Parliament. I'm simply being battered away by the Prime Minister and a whole succession of other ministers, and I think the British public deserve to know whether our democracy is being subverted, what happened in the referendum, and what the implications of that could be.
If she bats you away again, can anybody else find out? I mean, can any other committee of Parliament look into this?
Well, the Intelligence and Security Committee, as I understand it, is looking into all of this. The Culture, Media and Sports Committee have got the Electoral Commission and the National Crime Agency back in next week. So there are ample opportunities for us to continue to examine this. There are a number of excellent investigative journalists, including some of yours at Channel 4, still looking into this. And I understand that the report that the Daily Mail published today, that the Prime Minister blocked this, is extremely well and multiply sourced. So this is not going to go away, I'm afraid, until we know the truth about the referendum and what went on and where this money came from. We will not let this rest.
Brexiteers will say you're just trying to delay Brexit, aren't you, or overturn it, or run it all again.
There are plenty of other very good reasons for stopping the disaster of Brexit, but I've always been absolutely clear this is much more serious than this. This is about the integrity and the security of our democracy and our political system. And if we can't have confidence in that, I'm afraid whether you voted Leave or Remain, you should worry about it.
Yes, I hope that's all right, borrowing bits of Channel 4. I think for review and comment nowadays, because you can link so easily to clips on Twitter or other social media, that I think radio should be able to just use little bits as well, and I think that will gradually come over. So I think the podcast is a great idea, and it'll just help mix different bits up. But I think you should have comments from bloggers and radio, local radio even, as it goes on. Anyway, we'll come back to that. We'll see what response we get to using those clips. And meanwhile, going back to the play-out system, this one is called Pouring Water on a Drowning Man. It's by James Carr.